Okay, people, it's case time. It's case time. For today's case, I want to take you guys to a little country. Let me know in the chat if you've heard of this country, but we're going to a little country known as England. The little country, yes, Inglaterra. And today's case actually surrounds a disappearance that has remained unsolved for over 2 decades. The disappearance of China Rose Sims. It's a case that, unfortunately, I was not able to find too much on, which is why I'm glad that we're actually covering this case. I think this is an important case to tell. Again, fairly little known, and it does involve a person of color. China Rose was last seen around Valentine's Day over 2 decades ago. So it feels fairly apt with Valentine's Day being right here. Let me introduce you all first to a chap by the name of David Sims. David Sims is where this story begins. In the 1960s, David joined the Special Patrol Group. The Special Patrol Group was a branch of the British police. They basically handled a lot of like public disturbances and all that kind of, handling the riffraff. However, the Special Patrol Group also has since been disbanded because they were a very controversial group. They were known for using unnecessary and excessive force. Famously, in 1977, let me double check. In 1979, there was a group of British protesters. They were part of the Anti-Nazi League, which I guess is in many ways a precursor to Antifa. Anti-Nazi League has a better ring to it, in my opinion. League just makes it sound more, There was an anti-Nazi League protest, and the police decided they were going to, obviously get involved, and things escalated, got violent, and a special needs teacher, Blair Peach, was murdered by officers there that day. The report that was made on the incident said that Mr. Blair Peach was almost certainly killed by officers. And obviously an internal investigation was held into these officers' conduct in this protest and the murder of Blair Peach. And there was even, some stuff found that alleged that these officers participated in a cover-up. So we don't like that. David Sims was, again, a member of the Special Patrol Group. From some reports, David Sims, because of his involvement in this group, developed a drinking habit. Now, we don't know if it's specifically because of his involvement with this group or if he already had kind of an issue with alcohol and this sort of just exacerbated it. Either way, he was a violent drunk. David Sims was married thrice over. And per a report by The Guardian, the women who divorced him did so under the grounds of violent temper tantrums. We don't like that. It's horrible. Any sort of violence, abuse, horrible. Although it being described as a temper tantrum is somewhat of an interesting description. So I'm imagining him, being a very belligerent baby. Crazy Cat's cosplay, exactly. They make him sound like a pissed off toddler. Based on his description, that seems fairly apt. I will say this about David Sims. He's a horrible man that physically abused his wives, but he was also an equal opportunity offender because he was actually kicked out of the very violent SPG for assaulting his superiors there too. So you know what? Terrible person, but at least he assaults everyone. Which doesn't sound that great. He was kicked out of the Special Patrol Group for attacking another inspector while he was drunk and raging. This man was even too much for the Special Patrol Group. David Sims, he's not doing so well. He's no longer in the Special Patrol Group. He's been divorced 3 times. And so now he's thinking, what do I do next in life? He tried opening his own pub. That didn't work. And at some point, he ended up being a furniture salesman, a secondhand furniture salesman. He landed on his feet to a point where he thought, you know what? I've been divorced 3 times. Lucky number 4. Now, here is where, sadly, David Sims meets the subject of our case. China Rose is Filipina. By all accounts, she seemed to be a lovely person. Based on reports, David Sims met China Rose either one of 2 ways. Either he met her, allegedly, on a business trip to the Philippines, or other reports state that David Sims met China Rose through a dating service that specifically helped British foreigners, or foreigners in general, meet Filipinas. It certainly sounds like a service that this kind of like creep would want to use. I don't know what I just did there, but Rachel Chaos, I like it. Pinoy woman marries man-child. Yes, that is, I believe, what was on their wedding invites. And to make things a little bit extra icky, China Rose was 31 years old and 20 years younger than David. We can always say love is love. But, all things considered with this guy, It's not great. Not great. Not great. They get married. And they actually get married on Valentine's Day in 1988. My notes say that they returned to England after their marriage, after their wedding. And so that probably means that the wedding may have been in the Philippines. The two of them moved to a town in England called Southend. Do our Brits know in the chat know where that is? That is. I do not know what that handwriting is. That's life. They moved there in 1991, and there's a third character worth mentioning whose name is Jeffrey Paston. Jeffrey Paston is David's friend, and he is also married to a Filipina. Her name is Josie. They either both coincidentally married Filipinas, or they both maybe used the same dating service to find themselves Filipinas. Maybe a little fetishization going on there, which... Speaking of fetishization, my first girlfriend. She was my first girlfriend. I was her first boyfriend. And since then, she has only dated Asian men. And I remember her telling me that she only ever wanted to date Asian men after we broke up. Which, I don't know if that's flattering or creepy. Creepy, most likely. If the chat says it's creepy, then the chat is right. I don't know if she's in a relationship right now, but if she is in a relationship, I would wager that the man is Asian. Again, we know David's a bit of a sketchy character, and around this time, he also started using aliases. He went under the aliases Anthony Peter Lewis, or just Tony. So these were his aliases that he would use for business deals. And you see, David, he did go on many business deals. David and China often went to trips in Thailand where they would buy goods in Thailand and then take them to the UK and resell them. David and China's side hustle of reselling Thai goods didn't go so well, and things were not doing too great for them on the financial front. So China actually had to take an extra job. China took on a job working at the local nursing home, taking care of the elderly. Around this time, while China was doing her part to help them make ends meet, David, he was throwing more of his violent temper tantrums because he didn't like the fact that, they weren't, the most financially stable. Things weren't going too well with David, which tragically, surprise, surprise, isn't too surprising considering his 3 divorces based around violent temper tantrums, as well as his firing from the Special Patrol Group based around another violent temper tantrum. China told her sister Joy that David beat her, sadly, fairly regularly. And China told Joy that she wanted to leave, but she had nowhere to go. That is obviously one of the many issues with a situation like this, where China, from the Philippines, was brought all the way to the UK, away from family, away from her friends, and she's very isolated. So David obviously has a large amount of control over her. She had nowhere to go, and they probably didn't have the financial means to get her all the way back to the Philippines. In fact, China once told her sister Joy on the phone that David told China that he would get someone to kill her because it would be much cheaper than getting a divorce. So we don't like that. What the fuck indeed, Scarlett? Yes, those reactions are correct. Andrea says it was him. How is this unsolved? Well, we're getting there. A few years after they got married, China's father sadly gets quite sick. And obviously her family is all the way in the Philippines. She wants to go see him, but she obviously can't. Apparently, China Rose would express her desire to return to the Philippines and take care of her father at a Valentine's Day party in 1993. That is the last time China Rose Sims was ever seen again. Soon after, China's family, they grew very concerned, rightly so, because they suddenly stopped hearing from China, who would contact them often, to check in on not just their father, but her brother, her sister. She spoke with her sister Joy quite often, and so they were alarmed when they stopped hearing from her. About a month after Valentine's Day 1993, David Sims was seen living at their home in Southend on his own. Interestingly enough, though, soon after, a month or so later, David Sims himself was never seen again. David Sims himself disappeared. Finally, a formal investigation begins, which is kind of annoying that it took that long. It took the white man, to disappear before the investigation began, but it finally did. There's no real information about how they conducted the investigation, but basically, eventually, after a few years, they concluded that China Rose was dead. They said it was most likely possibly dead. David was seen as a person of interest in the possible murder of China Rose Sims. In the words of Detective Constable Fred Simpkins, Mr. Sims could be seen as a suspect, but they've both officially been missing for years, so we could be talking about a double murder. After 7 years, a person can be presumed legally dead. There was one other lead, though, that they pursued. That was this gentleman here, Mr. Jeffrey Paston. David's dear friend. Mr. Jeffrey Paston, he also disappeared, but people knew where he went to. You see, Mr. Jeffrey Paston, with his Filipino wife, or just because of his love of the Philippines, moved to the Philippines, to a town near Manila. In 1996, the British Embassy is still conducting an investigation into this case. Both the British Embassy in the Philippines and the Philippines Immigration Bureau conduct a watch of Jeffrey Paston, a look, an investigation into him. They monitor Jeffrey for a month. They learned that Jeffrey was apparently running a nightclub in the Philippines. And he was living with a Filipina. We don't know if it was the same Filipina as before, Josie, or if he's just found himself another Filipina. Who knows? A lot of these men, they love to go to the Southeast Asian countries. They love to go to Asian countries and be creeps. Sadly, I've seen it many a time myself. Grew up in Thailand. Separate topic. A lot of creepy things you see. A lot of creepy things you see at the bars and the clubs. After a month of monitoring Jeffrey, the Philippines Immigration Bureau and some officers from Essex who were visiting and helping with the case, they arrested Mr. Jeffrey Paston. And apparently he was also not doing so well with money. Despite having the nightclub, Jeffrey was also monetarily in the dumps, and he was actually living off of handouts that were given to him from his family back home in England. Inglaterra. In the questioning of Jeffrey Paston in regards to the disappearance of China Rose and David Sims, Jeffrey has some tea to spill. Jeffrey has himself he pours some little tea out for the cops. Jeffrey says, yes, David has actually he was in touch with me. And in fact, Jeffrey is the one that sold David's house. He sold David's house in Southend. Jeffrey sold David's house at David's request for a cool £40,000, which is a decent amount. David requested that Jeffrey sell the house for £40,000, and he also requested that Jeffrey put that £40,000 into a very specific bank account. The bank account was under the name of Anthony Peter Lewis, who was David Sims's alias. And then shortly after the £40,000 was put into a bank by Jeffrey, the money in the bank account was withdrawn by someone who claimed to be a representative of David. Someone claiming to be a representative of David Sims withdrew money from the account. They withdrew £30,000, but £10,000 remain in the account. And £10,000 remains in the account to this day. Well, Jeffrey told the police that he believed some heavy characters were involved in this mutual disappearance. Some police obviously believe that David murdered China Rose and somehow did something with her body that has allowed it to remain unfound to this day. They also then believe that David Sims fled the country and moved to Thailand shortly after, and then got in touch with Jeff, and then he's just disappeared off the face of this earth, hiding away in Thailand like the little rat he is. Let me note something. Even if he's still dead, I hope that little rat is burning in hell, baby. I don't regret saying it. However, there are other theories at play. Another detective involved in the case, in an interview with The Guardian, who was a great source for this research, by the way, so thank you to The Guardian, shout out. They believe that David was involved in these businesses, as we know, in both the Philippines and Thailand, and that he may have actually gotten involved with the drug trade in those countries. So remember, David Sims has Jeffrey Paston put £40,000 sold from their house into a bank account under his alias. £30,000 is withdrawn from that bank account, leaving £10,000. £10,000, again, remains there still to this day. So that remaining £10,000 was never and still remains unwithdrawn as far as I'm aware. Other theories involve that David was murdered as well as a result of his connections in the drug trade, and that's why the remaining £10,000 just sits there. Because obviously he's dead, he can't withdraw the rest. The alternate theory by some other officers, other investigators, is that David has actually found ways to make even more money, that he's gotten even deeper into the drug trafficking, and so maybe he's made a lot more money, and now he's just on the lam enjoying the riches of his, criminal behavior. But one final thing I want to note is that per The Guardian, they did an interview with David Sims' two daughters from his first marriage. This interview was conducted with David Sims' daughters in 2001, which again was like around the last time there was an official update on this case. In this interview, his two daughters claimed that every year, even though they weren't that close with him, he would send them birthday and Christmas cards. However, between the years of 1993 and up until that date of 2001, when they did the interview, they had received nothing from him. No cards, nothing. And because of this, David Sims' eldest daughter, Linda, she basically admits that she believes that her father is dead. She says, and I quote, "He was a jack the lad and a bit cocky. He also had a terrible temper. He could well have gotten himself into trouble. I think he has come to a sticky end." So his daughters believe he, too, was murdered. And so, ladies and gentlemen, as always, that's when I turn it over to all of you. Irish Rose Casey with the movie plot twist, which is I still think Jeffrey and China might have run away together and killed David. Wow. See, this is why I enjoy sharing these cases with you all, because your minds go to places I certainly wouldn't have thought. And that would have been quite a way for the story to go. Imagine that. Jeffrey Paston and China secretly fall in love behind David Sims' back, and they plot all along to make it look like David's killed China, and then they kill David himself. That's like something out of a movie. Parrothead Annie says, David killed his wife, ran off to the Philippines. The friends were going to make a living taking advantage of women, wives, family got a revenge. Oh, interesting. Okay. So you believe that David went back to the Philippines with Jeffrey, and then China's family got revenge? And this is a very good point Jade Wolf makes. Maybe if police had looked into her disappearance, they could have talked to him. Exactly. From what I understand, the police didn't start looking into this case until David himself disappeared. And so if they had realized that China Rose had disappeared earlier, they could have questioned him and gotten a little bit more info. Irish Rose Casey says, David was complete scum. You're not wrong there. Truly, that's why. David Sims may very well be dead. He may very well have disappeared. But there's a reason why this video, why this case, why my whiteboard only says the disappearance of China Rose Sims. Because truly, and maybe it's unprofessional for me to say this as, I guess, someone who covers true crime, but I don't give a fuck about David Sims. Dewey says, to be honest, it's obvious he killed her. The only question is if we'll ever find him so we know the full story. Honestly, I mean, I'm inclined to lean towards that theory as well. I do think David Sims murdered China Rose Sims. I think he murdered China Rose Sims, and that he fled the country. He had connections in Thailand, in the Philippines. And honestly, again, having grown up in Thailand, you could live off of very little in that country. The cost of living in Thailand is so little. The 30,000 pounds that David Sims got from his house that Jeffrey Paston sold, I mean, that 30,000 pounds goes a long way in Thailand, and he could have sustained himself for many years off of that, not to mention whatever money he could have made as a foreigner in Thailand. It's a sad case all around. I mean, the story of this Filipina who moved to a country foreign from her own without her family and friends and wanted to leave, but didn't have the means to and had no way out, and sadly met most likely a very horrible demise at the hands of a man who a man who was known to not be a very good person. I looked into other Valentine's Day cases potentially, but this was the one I decided to go for just because I felt like it was one that didn't have too much attention, and I wanted to shed the light on a case involving, an Asian victim. Happy Valentine's Day! Inglaterra.